So Larry, I want to go to you first and just get some general reaction, shock, horror, pain, but there was some gleeful moments. There was, that baby.
He knows all this already.
But I'd love to hear from your perspective what kind of memories it dredged up for you.
Well, I think it just reinforced a point that is terrifying to recognize, and that is we have no capacity to govern in the United States. I mean, I met these guys, I knew these guys at the birth of YouTube, at the birth of Google. I remember going into Larry Page's cubicle and him telling me about the future of what Google would be. None of these people had any clue about how this would develop. None of them understood what advertising would be. They had no conception of AI-driven targeting. This was not anywhere in their vision. What they had was an objective to figure out how to use technology to make money. And that's what they did. They figured out these extraordinary technologies of AI that understand how to exploit your weaknesses, our psychological weaknesses, the way the fast food industry is able to exploit our eating weaknesses. But this is much more dangerous because it takes us into places we don't even recognize we're being walked into. And so, it's a company trying to make money, producing great harm to society. You would think there's a thing called government that might step up and say, what should we do in response? But the reality is our government's completely captured. Like there's just zero chance that they will step up and do anything in response to this because of the enormous amount of money that gets channeled. And I'll tell you a particularly depressing, because I love her as a representative, example of this. Just after all of the TikTok scare was blowing up and people were recognizing the vulnerability of the nation from this platform and what it was doing to whole swaths of our society, and people were calling on governments to regulate, to do something about this platform, and states like Montana started doing something. AOC launched her first TikTok video. And the TikTok video was her describing how it would be unfair to regulate TikTok when we had not passed privacy legislation in the United States. Which signaled, number one, she didn't understand what the problem was. But more importantly to me, it signaled that the Democratic Party had the channels open of endless money from technology companies, and they were no longer going to be in the fight to do something about these technologies. So this is a horrible story, even though it includes some of the most inspirational people I could imagine. It's the best, as Aaron says in that movie, the internet's the best and the worst, both, right? It's both together. But I fear the worst begins to dominate as this underlying business model runs over everything, and we don't have a governance model to resist it.
Yeah, I think the business model is an important part of the story, both when it comes to YouTube and the monetization of content that also fuels some of the, and literally funds, hate, harassment, and incitement. But this was a value, paying content creators, that was largely pushed by progressives and the left early on when people were making content for YouTube and not getting anything back. YouTube was taking everything. Now they take something like 30% of everything. And the stuff that I was researching when I was at Data and Society in a report with Becca Lewis on the Alternative Influence Network, what we were trying to show clearly was how hate traveled through YouTube, and many of the people in the documentary are in that report, and that report was really about showing YouTube how small the problem really was. It was about 80 white supremacists that were spread across hundreds of channels because they would say anything and super chats would roll in or other kinds of monetization would happen. And just like Faraday Speaks, which is the young man that had fallen down the alt-right, Caleb, he had fallen down the alt-right pipeline. He was looking for content where the left were debating the right. And he was in some of the left tube or bread tube YouTubers that he had quoted, like Destiny, or we saw ContraPoints in the film, really had a distinct point of view because they didn't back away from talking to people on the right. But at the same time, what it did is it raised the profile of a bunch of people that probably would have been left to obscurity on YouTube. And so I want to talk to you about the choices you had to make in editing so that you could capture the vitriol without giving them
More of a platform.
Exactly.
Yeah, obviously something I was thinking a lot about. I don't like centering terrible people and just giving them. That's why there isn't. We focused on a few people, and there are certain people like Molyneux who you can't not talk about because he's so significant, and especially in his role in the Christchurch shooting. But Crowder, it was important to show, and I think that for me, something that you both said was kind of, not that we have a thesis. I mean, we kind of do. We sort of hide it. We bury it as well as we possibly can, so the film doesn't get preachy. But I was sort of intent on kind of getting away from this discourse around algorithms, which I think is intentionally obfuscating. And I was trying to focus more on business model, which is just much more a human incentive, an understandable one, and it's one you can't wriggle out from around. So that also had a lot to do with who I wanted to focus on, because people like Crowder, those people, you were talking about voices that were raised up, and that we saw a lot of that happen with Gamergate, which is why I spent time on Gamergate. I remember when I was sort of very immersed in that when it was happening, it was evident that there were powers in the background that had figured out they could weaponize sort of the rise of this disenfranchised, mostly white, younger male, right? And actually quasi-organize them even without them knowing they were being organized. And so to a degree, you had some people who got elevated by that. But then you had a lot of dark money and other sort of finance interests specifically funding individual groups that then got hyper promoted by YouTube because they were connecting with so many people and monetized. So it was that gas on the fire of a far right ideological group with a lot of money funds a Crowder channel. That channel starts to do well. YouTube kicks in with their business model and proliferates that around the world. And so I wanted to focus on enough of those to make that point clear. Mm-hmm. I think I had a guy, I can't remember, there was one of the ones you were at. It's a bit of a blur, this bus and truck tour I'm on. But someone asked me the other night, I think it was at UPenn, what the difference was between the sort of the Fox News effect and the YouTube effect. And that's the difference. You can have Molyneux sort of calling for Muslims to be slaughtered, and they get slaughtered, and they deplatform him. But this disinformation is everywhere. It's all over the world, and even Fox News has standards and practices, even though I'd say they're not particularly well followed. But it proliferates in a completely different way. Going back a little bit to what Becca Lewis and you were talking about from Data and Society, which is why I sought out Becca, which is the parasocial component and the idea that you are connecting with someone through webcam, eyeball to eyeball. The power that has is really not comparable to Sean Hannity in a suit talking to someone who's already on his side. And then you spread that by 4.6 billion video views a day all over the world into every home, left, right, center, and otherwise. And there's a potential to radicalize there that I think far exceeds the potential to radicalize on Fox. So that was sort of the other thing that I wanted to focus on in terms of who we showed and who we didn't. But it was tricky, for sure. And it was also, we're human beings. So me and my editor we watched thousands of hours of YouTube content, and I'm sure I'm not sane anymore. But
I feel like I need to give you a baptism or something, or wash you of this.
Yeah.
But the feeling that you get when you're watching someone who almost looks and feels like you're on a webcam because they're talking to you about the thing that you're interested in, that's really powerful. If you need a brain cleaner, there's a great YouTuber named Swoop that's been doing these really interesting documentaries on the downfall of certain YouTubers. So I highly recommend her content as a way to look at, well, if this is the worst, what might be promising for some YouTube channels? Because I think that young people especially are really expressing themselves not just by playing games or unboxing videos, but by who they make comments on and who they watch and what videos they share on their social media. And what I'd love to know is, from you, Larry, how does the sort of material joy and excess of social media, where you are centered as not just the audience but also a producer, change how people might care about policy and the law? Does it seem to tilt them in the direction of free speech at any cost because they're invested and this is their right? It just feels fundamentally different from the way other laws might be made, is that we don't have any laws really about the internet except that you can't touch the internet. Mm-hmm. And I've often tried to think about, well, where is young people's position on this because of their own investment in it?
I think the reality is people are just alienated, completely alienated from the legislative process. Mm-hmm. You know, part of the reason for that is that they're all my age and older, right? So the idea that they could connect in a real way to the making of laws is really hard. But you know, the framing around things like Section 230, which insulates these companies from any responsibility, has been so perfectly crafted to be set up as if, I mean, you had a wonderful exchange about this, as if it's a choice about whether to have the internet or not.
Right.
You touch 230 and there's no internet anymore. And so, you know, if you tell people that's what the choice is, it's pretty clear on what side they're going to be on that choice. But there's no effort to help anybody understand that there's something more. And again, that's because our representative body is so absolutely paralyzed in its ability to do anything about it. I mean, you can stop anything in Washington. I mean, the easiest thing to do is to stop something. The impossibly hard thing to do is to get something to occur. But there are 1,000 places to stop it. And it doesn't cost that much to stop anything. And these companies have all the money in the world. So, you know, now the other dimension of this that's really terrifying, and this has just been teed up, is, you know, one thing to say Congress is not going to do anything. It's another thing to say Congress is not allowed to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And the Supreme Court is about to step into this question of whether we can do anything about misinformation, even if it's just people trying to persuade the companies to do something about misinformation. And the suggestion is the First Amendment blocks the government from doing anything about the problem which the government's own laws have created. And when that happens, we're really going to be stuck.
Mm-hmm. That is very true. So it's 8 o'clock and it's literally my bedtime. So I'm going to tag in Ron Suskind, who is an incredible interviewer, critic, journalist, book writer, entertainer.
Has his own great documentary, which I'm sure you've all already seen.
I have to catch a plane to Chicago, but I'm going to have you.
Thanks, Joan.
I'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah, I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks.
I'll tag team for Joan. I just would like to, with a group here, throw up a round of applause for Joan. Joan has been the great voice of so much. She really has. A hero. So let me throw something to you, Alex. You've been in this place a long time. You've made many films. At this point in an evolution over some years, are you feeling as though there is, let's just say, gathering a moment, especially with, let's just say, events like our Capitol being pillaged, where people are going, all right, well, this is a problem. I don't know what the solution is, but at least I'm recognizing there's a problem. That's often the first step, if you think historically, and I know you do. Are we at a point at least where there's that recognition? And then I'm going to ask Larry what a solution might look like
Right.
to 230, so get ready for that.
Okay.
So are we at the point in which the problem is recognized, something need be done?
I think that you know, I'm sort of a long-term optimist around these issues, but that's where I can be unpopular even in my own industry is I think the short term, meaning the next 5 to 15 to 20 years, is going to be pretty brutal. I think that AI is going to sweep into this process and start hurting labor and marginalized groups in ways unlike we can imagine. And I think that the propagandizing of, to Larry's point, how you can even discuss technology has crippled our ability to be able to be effective in these areas. Like, there are really bad bills out there like COSA and some of what the EU is doing, even though they're trying, that are, you know, likely to hurt the people that they're trying to help and help the people that they're trying to hurt. So I think that mess is going to go on for a while. What gives me hope is that I do agree with you that on a fundamental level, and I've been around the internet pretty significantly just for my own life. I'm not a hacker or an engineer, but just as a punter who's been immersed in the internet since probably 83, 84, pretty seriously. For the first time, I feel like sort of global culture is now online and understands that there are problems. And when I go and I show this movie to high schools all over the world, you know, those kids aren't like, oh, we don't need the Gen X guy telling us about the internet. They're like, no, we like the fact that the film isn't telling us to get off platform like so many other films or articles do, and still recognizes that there's a problem because the younger generations want to be on platform, but they recognize the harms of being on platform. I think that's a huge, huge step in creating effective solutions. I get pretty disheartened by the rhetoric of sort of my generation and a lot of the media of my generation is just like, don't let your kids on the platform, don't let them pick up technology, make them go outside. Just very kind of almost sort of just highly impractical and ineffective means of dealing with where we are.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so there is an obvious, easy answer to
Yeah.
230, but here's the problem.
Okay.
That's not the problem.
Okay.
I mean, 230 is a problem, right? And so you could easily flip it so that once they're on notice that there's an issue, like they were with many of the stories you were talking about, they had to do something about it. But if you start thinking that we can solve the problem by dealing with the outliers or the kind of extreme cases, you're missing the point you were just making, Alex, that it's the business model. It's the whole business model. And you need to start regulating the business model. You need to make it so that, you know, imagine something like an engagement tax. I know the word tax is not an utterable word in Washington, but pretend we can utter the word tax. And an engagement tax, let's say it's quadratic. It goes up as a square of the amount of time you're engaging. So that as the platform knows that you're going from 1 hour to 2 hours to 3 hours, its tax on you goes up. So at a certain point, they're like, thank you very much, Ron. Time for you to go out for a walk because we don't want any more of your attention. But that is like a completely plausible thing you could imagine a government doing. Taxing is what we do all the time. But why won't we ever do anything like that? Well, you know, you have to answer that question. You know exactly why.
The revenues could be enormous. What would those revenues be applied to? First, talk about that.
Yeah, the tax revenues, right? So there are problems, but again, I think that one thing I think this is so powerful in getting people to see the narrative in ordinary people's lives. I mean, I'm a student of Ron for many years. This is Ron's overwhelming lesson. You've got to put it into a narrative so that people connect to it.
Yeah.
But one risk the narrative creates is that it's hard to see the systematic. It's like linking all these things together.
Yeah.
But you've pointed to it. The systematic reality is they've got a business model to maximize engagement. What could possibly go wrong? Well, we see what goes wrong.
Yeah.
And now we don't have any capacity to do anything about it. And
Yeah. The business model runs counter to, what you were saying earlier, is that there are a lot of narratives that are being sort of amplified to keep people off the scent of doing anything. And one of those is the sort of idea that, and there are books about it, articles every day saying, well, you can't tamper with free speech, or you can't tamper with, letting people just say what they want to say, which is music to Google's ears, because that completely circumvents the reality that they are intentionally monetizing this harmful content because they know it draws eyeballs and gives them ad revenue. So there's a disingenuity to that argument. Not all the time. There are free speech issues. We were at Berkeley, we were talking about 230 and free speech up at the law school there just a few weeks ago. There's complexity to 230, obviously, but it's the monetization, it's the business model that's the inarguable problem, because as long as they are profiting by promoting and creating algorithms that promote this type of content, they're never, ever going to be incentivized to not do that. They're just not.
Yep. Well, let me just throw one thing in. I've written, as some of you know, many books on politics, on the national affairs of this unfinished experiment in democracy that we're all in. And, it's fascinating to see across 25 years of this, the extraordinary changes that really now define the day. I mean, let's be very clear here. If I were to hope to be successful in Congress, I would look at the pathway of Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, just name them. There's a whole cast of characters, mostly on the Republican side, who now have forged a new model. Models for gaining and expanding power will be replicated until they are proven to be ineffective. Well, that's now the model, right? What I do is I use attention and conflict, both. They're two, really. It's not just attention. Conflict is essential as well. Mm-hmm. Attention and conflict, which, gets me a significant following. That significant following, as Gates said, just 2 or 3 weeks ago now, when the Speaker of the House was decapitated, and someone was holding up a phone to say, as he was doing this from the well of the House there, that they were getting an appeal, another congressman, for money from Gates. Look at me. And he's like, you bet. $10, $20, $30 contributions for working Americans? I'll take that any day over the PACs and the special interests.
Sure.
And I'm like, oh my God, he just did an advertisement from the well of the House as he eviscerated the Speaker. Okay? What more do you need to know? All right, so now a capture has been effected, a significant capture of our central political institution, the seat of government. All right? It's not just the kids you talk about who come to the high school gatherings. It's not just people my age. I'm older than Larry.
By a day.
Just a few hours, 'cause, twins. And I asked whether learned players like you can maybe deconstruct the issue of not just the business model, but the nature of attention itself. Mm-hmm. Why is it in this economy a thing of such created value? Okay?
Sure.
I mean, because it has not always been.
Yeah.
Okay? The one I grew up in, it wasn't.
Yeah, not in this way.
Not in this
other
way.
ways, yeah.
Yeah, in other ways, but it's certainly not in this way.
Yeah.
And so part of the question is, if the business model is to be reconstructed, how? Mm-hmm. And the question of why attention has essentially been the central ingredient in an article that has not just been defining of our lives, but has been there to collapse our institutions. As a journalist, I'll just tell you frankly, my profession is on its knees right now. I mean, we will soon be in a place where there may not be any of the institutions, even the flagships of journalism that you now know. All right, most of them are gone. right? There's 3 flagships left in a fleet that was widely populated when I'm a young man. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Trio. 3. Their business model has been eviscerated. They're holding on because they are essentially the category killers left in those 3 areas. Attention. How do we rethink attention, and how does that become a story? 2 sides.
I can speak quickly to the attention side from, just having grown up in the entertainment industry since I was 6, 7 years old. And also having grown up, largely in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. What I saw happening, again, just from my own perspective, was, at the same time as sort of coming out of the Reagan era, at the same time as sort of the hyper rise of global inequality and hyper marginalization, you also had the internet and sort of rise of new technology, which was a very interesting collision because, my first film was about Napster, which Larry was in, which I was around for, and I knew those guys very well when they were actually making that and fighting with David Boies in the courts. And that was a class fight, frankly. Most of the Napster guys were working class. There was a kind of generational, class-oriented disdain for the establishment that wasn't so much about getting rich. I mean, some of them there did want to do that, and they did get rich. But Sean Fanning and sort of the core people there had sort of a more ideological viewpoint. And what happened was the self-proclaimed barbarians, the proud barbarians, stormed the gate, right? And suddenly you had the ability for the sort of democratization. The gatekeepers were just mowed over, and the sort of prior walls of barrier between the working classes and the elite world of entertainment and attention were just evaporated overnight. And that storm has kept on going. And once you had the iPhone and you had the YouTube and the internet, the ability for anybody anywhere to suddenly be a star or to break the gates down or to be heard, to speak in their webcam and have someone on the other end, connect with them. I think that it created a kind of an energy, sort of a vacuum got filled where people were like, screw it, we want to be heard, we want to be seen. And almost all of, this, so I mean, you've written about this, but so much of what the GOP does well is they act as if they're on those people's sides, right? Like we're just the common folk like you. So you have people like Matt Gaetz who's doing a routine, it's a shtick. He knows he's not of the people, right? But it's this idea of like, hey, barbarians who have stormed the gates, we're with you. And that's what J6 was at the end of the day. So I think there's a shock of the new that will recede to a certain degree. But I do think that, we're it's a very tenuous position, especially given that once this sort of floodgate opening becomes monetizable by powered interests, either political or purely capitalist like Google, I just think it's gas on a fire, And then I think democracy is Larry's talked about this, very well, but then I think it's actually like potentially the end of the democratic process.
Yeah, I don't accept the premise that humans have changed. The environment within which humans are living has changed.
Yeah, I agree.
We reflect on the fact that the Lincoln-Douglas debates would have people come and listen to the two debating for hours at a time. And like, how is that conceivable? Well, the answer to that is, what the hell else were they going to be doing? Which is the most interesting show in town, where everything else was just quiet, crickets all the time. But if you would take those very same people who spent hours listening to Lincoln Douglas and given them an iPhone and YouTube, they would be no different from kids. Like maybe it would take them a couple weeks, but eventually they would be like, yeah, Lincoln, could you just be quiet? Because I've got this 30-second YouTube video I want to be watching. So I think we need to recognize that we as humans have psychological vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Just like we as humans have physical vulnerabilities when we talk about what we eat, right? So the very same story we could tell about fast food and processed food, like taking over the diet of Americans and turning us into wildly unhealthy people, is just a product of like how our bodies evolved, and now they're hacking our bodies in response to that evolution. That's exactly what is happening with the digital technologies. They're hacking our brain. They're like figuring out what are the psychological, B.J. Fogg, really great professor at Stanford, digital design, educated the whole generation of people who went off to build these platforms, teaching them what the tricks were, the psychological tricks that they could deploy to make it so humans couldn't resist their platforms. It's not a choice, it's just a drug, and it's a digital drug, and they figured out how to do it, and that's exactly what they're doing. So, random rewards, we're just psychologically tuned to be vulnerable to random rewards. Bottomless pits of content, we can't stop eating, it's popcorn, we can't stop eating that bottomless pit. And so, we just have to recognize we're vulnerable and figure out how to protect ourselves from it. I think the same thing with democracy. We can't do democracy in this space.
No.
It's like radiation. Like all of a sudden, the ozone opened up and all the radiation comes in, and we've got to move democracy underground. Like, we've got to protect it from these forces, because we can't will ourselves to stop watching crazies like Matt Gaetz. We're not going to do that. So we can't rely on that institution in the way that we have before. But that's kind of terrifying, especially for us old people, because we can't imagine what the alternative would be.
But I do think if you start to fix some of the actual underlying problems, and then in a way that is taking democracy underground, like if you do start to that's what needs to happen with regulation. And really goes back to your initial question, is I do think we're going to end up with effective legislation at some point. I do. I think that we are at a tipping.
Would you have a bet on that, Alex? Because
I really do. I think that we're at a tipping point, and I think that younger generations are not willing. The harms that are being inflicted upon them, and the sort of lack of ability for them to just live their lives as who they are, and the sort of weaponizing, whether it's turf movements or whatever, any other sort of form of hate movement that can gain traction via the net. These are real harms that are hitting people. The sort of rampant inequality that's only going to get worse, sort of with the rise of new technologies. So I think we're hitting a tipping point. I really do. I think that
all you've established is we're at a place where things are going to get really, really bad. What you haven't shown is that translates into us doing something about it.
Well, that's where I was getting to. Was when you're talking now, when I'm like what I did during the labor strike, was I started talking to people that I could find in the areas of AI and policy who were beginning to craft, at least understood the issues and were beginning to craft ideas for how to legislate those. And there's a lot of really smart people out there who are now there are people sort of I don't want to name names, especially as we're on camera, but people who have left Google, and other places that are doing really good work. There are people here doing that. And so when I go out into the field and I'm talking to people about ways forward, there are legitimate ways forward. They have to pass this lobby barrier that you're talking about, which has been impenetrable so far. But I will also tell you that having made this film, I've talked to a lot of Google engineers, and some of whom, they weren't all off the record, who have all said, thank God you did this, it's about frickin' time, some of these things. And it's not like this is so amazing or anything, but just that it's part of, I think, a new attempt to begin to articulate ways forward and isolate and identify the problem. And I think we're going to see more and more of that, especially from younger people coming up, who I don't think are going to take this lying down. And I think in a way it will hopefully be, like getting seatbelts into cars took 60 years. We did it, but we had to fight like hell to do it.
Yeah.
So,
big pieces of legislation often do take decades.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, someone pointed out to me that without government regulating or telling business, in some cases, what it cannot do, business will do. They're big meat-eating animals.
Yeah.
They must eat. And unless you say, no, I've got a gun here, you can't, back off, they will. Look, the British government was selling, products to Nazi Germany until the end of 1942. Well, until the law said can't anymore. So that's the way government does work, and it has worked in crises before. I think the gathering of at least an understanding of crisis and a feeling of crisis, as much as anything, like I feel it, maybe will be the prompt for action. That when I say what makes me at least reasonably hopeful that I'm not depressing everyone at the dinner table is that generally we do rise as a nation and as a government to step up when we are faced with horrific and existential, in some cases, challenges. I mean, we have in the past.
It takes courage and willingness to lose.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, Joan is not here in a literal and a figurative sense.
Yep.
Joan is not at the Harvard University table anymore because of exactly this kind of influence and corruption. And how many people stood up and said, what the hell? Right? And if you can't even do it at your own home, how are you going to do it like remaking the nation?
Well, I mean, look, at one point I talked to John Lewis, I think it was after Eric Garner was strangled, was killed. I was in his office in Washington, and he said, look, for me, this is a good day and a hopeful day. He says it's a sunny afternoon, and there are people all over America filling the streets. Many other very valuable things they might be doing today, but they're not. They're together, all races and creeds, and they're in the street because a single black man was killed. Right? How many black men have I seen killed in my life, Ron? I can't count them all. They would fill many stadiums. But one black man is killed, and people say enough. I now will gather, again, across all the divides, and I will stand up. John said, hope, that's what it looks like.
Yeah.
It may not result in our lifetime even to some of the changes that we know are so pressing and so needed. But it is the seedbed from which change does occur. And it's important we at least see that, because from that, we will probably see the future. So maybe I'll end on that happy note.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming, everybody. Thank you.